This is The Harvest of the Years by Luther Burbank with Wilbur Hall. It's an autobiography of Luther Burbank. Copyright 1926. Starts out with a quote. When we no longer look at an organic being as a savage looks at a ship, as something wholly beyond his comprehension, when we regard every production of nature as one which has had a long history, when we contemplate every complex structure and instinct as the summing up of many contrivances, each useful to the possessor, in the same way as any great mechanical invention is the summing up of the labor, the experience, the reason, and even the blunders of numerous workmen. When we thus view each organic being, how far more interesting, I speak from experience, does the study of natural history become? Charles Darwin. So you can find this on the Internet Archive. And here is a biographical sketch from Wilbur Hall. Luther Burbank was past 60 before he could find the time he desired for making the Luther Burbank was past 60 before he could find the time he desired for making the exact records of his innumerable and unique experiments with plants. He was 70 before the itch that had always been on him to express on paper his thoughts, reactions, observations, and philosophies could even in a slight measure be gratified. Unquestionably, if he had lived, he would have poured forth his naturalist soul, and the last years would have been productive of exhilarating, pungent, and enlightening essays and books that would have greatly enriched our literature of thought and comment. What is saved of all the treasure he had stored happens to be this volume. He wrote and left behind him, first and last, more than 1,000,000 words concerning his intimate friendships with plants. But what he felt and thought, what he aspired to, and how much he achieved, the things he saw in life and learned from experience, what disappointments were his, and what triumphs, the true picture of the gallant, lovable, kindly, shrewd, whimsical Luther Burbank, will never be limned, in his own words, except in these pages. That it was I who came to this rare opportunity resulted on the mere accident of my writing habitually in the vernacular in which Luther Burbank thought. Working with him on a briefer and more prosy volume, I was interrupted by the little big chief a dozen times an hour with some surprised, characteristic ejaculation. "When did I tell you that? How did you happen to put that in? That isn't what I said, but that's the way I would have said it." It developed presently that my natural idiom was so like his own that he himself could not say where something he had written left off and something I was quoting or filling in began. This delighted him out of all proportion. "He does all the work," he would exclaim whimsically. "He grinds away, getting a hot box on that old typewriter, and out pops a book in my very words." And he would laugh and rub his hands and make innocent bystanders listen to the selections from the manuscript. He was like a boy with a mechanical monkey that will climb a string. From a very practical and utilitarian purpose, Luther Burbank had dictated at one time and another an amazing mass of material concerning his methods, technique, experiments, and scientific discoveries in the world of plants. Browsing through this heavy pasturage with one eye open for cowslips, I came frequently on paragraphs having nothing to do, or nothing immediate, with the subject matter, but that gave me, in flashing glimpses, a vague picture of the real mind and soul of the man. I had thought of him as a wizard of plant life, as what Hugo de Vries, the Dutch botanist, called him, a gardener touched with genius. I began to see him as a cosmopolite and polished man of the world, as a philosopher, as a naturalist in love with nature and life, as a humanist at once keenly interested in man and penetrating and exact in his judgments of men. I began to realize him as an extraordinary and versatile thinker. I began to appraise him as a copy. He fell in with the project for this book with ready enthusiasm. "Folks wonder how I've kept so young," he said one day. "I'm almost 77, and I can still go over a gate or run a foot race or kick the chandelier. That's because my body is no older than my mind, and my mind is adolescent. It has never grown up. It never will, I hope. I'm as inquisitive as I was at 8. It was true. He could not pass a new house, a shop window, a patent washing machine, a ditch digger, a strange plant, or a carpenter at work without stopping to look or watch. He was always asking, "What is this?" And then, "How does it work?" This insatiable and consuming appetite of his for new information was the basis, of course, for his achievements in the plant world. More important for my purposes, it was the explanation of his incredible knowledge of life. What he knew was only the beginning of what he wanted to know. That is why his judgments were both profound and tolerant. He saw through men and events and movements and motives, but the incompleteness of all data caused him to stop short of conclusions. Up to now, he was saying, we are what we are because of our heredities and environments. But this is not the end. It may be only the beginning. I don't know what the end will be. No man knows anything that's final. Wait a while. Hold your horses. These folks want you for the weekend, he said once to his beloved wife and playfellow Betty. You'll lug along a lot of dresses, you'll go to long dinners and be kept up till midnight. You'll make calls you don't want to and listen to bores and come home all tuckered out. You don't want to go down there at all. You don't want to bother. Then he stepped back, put his head on his side, and chuckled. Or do you? He concluded. The outline for this book absorbed him, though it was being made at his busiest season, when the press of other work on him was heavy and constant. He enjoyed every minute of it. A phrase would give him an idea that would start him off on a half-hour's excursion into memory. A question would shoot him out of his chair as though he had been propelled from a gun and send him scurrying to the bookshelves or his manuscript files for a reference, a date, a name, or a fact. You would be in the midst of a knotty section, and he would come suddenly bolt, shouting over his shoulder, "Come along, I've just thought of something." And it would be a photograph, a clipping in an old scrapbook, or a letter that would fit in and shed an effulgent and illuminating light on the murky corner. He took huge delight in my own inquisitiveness, half a habit, half caught for him. "Never saw such a fellow," he exclaimed to Mrs. Burbank. "Into everything, upstairs and downstairs, cellar to garret. He trails me into the gardens. He doesn't know what bashfulness is. He pesters me night and day, and he asks questions I wouldn't answer from the grand jury," he laughed. "I never know where he'll be next. Wouldn't be a bit surprised some night to turn back my covers and find him in my bed." He took a sly, impish delight in pretending that he wanted to get into this record some points that his wife wouldn't approve. He would hatch up the most scandalous schemes for revelations. He would whisper and wink and let on that we were in a deep conspiracy to circumvent her and publish appalling confessions. When she left the room one day, he put a hand on my knee and jerked the thumb toward the door she had just passed through. "She don't like this religious talk," he whispered staggily. "Don't like it at all. She was raised Advent. We'll have to be cute to get away with it." Then, when you almost began to take him seriously, he would tell her the whole joke and laugh and laugh and laugh. It was like collaborating with a vaudeville program. Underlying all his fun and whimsy and his tendency toward an almost boisterous exuberance was the tenderness of a mother and the sensitiveness of a child. His humor was that poignant sort which is akin to tears. Just under his highest mood was a serious, deep, understanding sympathy. A dog, a child, a tramp, an ailing woman, an unfortunate, a crippled bird, even a broken blossom on one of his own plants, could move him to great lengths of pity and generosity. Children loved and understood him. He was the friend of all the youngsters of the countryside. The needy actually imposed on him. He had an unfailing instinct for sham, but his heart usually played his head false and made him give even to rascals and frauds. His love and tenderness expressed themselves in hyperbole. Sitting around the table one night with his wife and her little niece and ward, Betty Jane, and with Bonita, his dog, half a whippet, half some short-haired terrier or nameless lineage, Luther Burbank took a large sheet of paper and on it drew a great pyramid, a medium pyramid, and a smaller pyramid. Then, in one far corner of the page, he drew a regular picket fence of microscopic ones. "That's what I've been trying to get at for months," he said, as though it were the working drawing of an epochal invention. "That's what I've been trying to get at for months," he said, as though it were the working drawing of an epochal invention. "It's very interesting," Mrs. Burbank said, "but what does it mean?" The big chief put his pencil point on the first triangle. "That is you," he said sensuously. "This one is Betty Jane, and this is Bonita." Then he touched the inconsequential line off in the corner. He fairly brushed it aside. "That's the rest of the world," he said. He loved extravagant expressions and descriptions, and employed them always except when they might be misunderstood or might deceive someone. He never said, "I have to keep in touch with my men." No, he would exclaim excitedly, "Land alive! Those men can't work for more than a year without my dropping in once in a while and telling them what I want done." "There isn't a stamp in this house," he said once. "You would think somebody would buy stamps enough sometime for a change." He turned to his secretary. "I wish you'd go down to the post office and buy $2,000 worth of 2-cent stamps." If someone hadn't stopped her, she would have obeyed that order. She was a single-minded and loyal soul. "Well," he would sigh, "there's no use trying to make that fellow over, I suppose. But some day he'll grow into his hoe, leaning on it the way he does, and they'll both rust down together." "Photographers?" he cried. "You'd think they'd made enough pictures of me, wouldn't you? I'll bet I've been snapped 10 million times." Numbers meant little to him. He liked to roll large figures on his tongue. "I guess I've met as many people as anybody that ever stayed home and tried to tend to business. They've come in hundreds of thousands. And letters? There are 8,000 unanswered letters right in that box, and every mail anywhere from 200 to 500 more come in." But the moment he was talking of his work, his methods, his experiments, or his results, he was as coldly exact and meticulous as a chemist mixing high explosives. Finding them extravagant in his casual speech, there were those who thought he might be extravagant in his reports, his assertions, or his claims. If they tried to test him, they came out of the encounter with their fingers burned. He never made a mistake there. The first project completed, the work on this book was begun. And for 2 months, it went forward with Mr. Burbank, ever a more enthusiastic and ever more helpful and generous collaborator. He never tired of it, though he was often pitifully and tragically tired. Early in the spring of 1926, repeating what he had been saying for 40 years, though perhaps in different words, Luther Burbank precipitated a religious controversy that, with himself a storm center, swept the whole country and cast its light pretty well around the world. He had grown increasingly impatient with bigotry and superstition as his own first-hand acquaintance with nature and science had developed. The trial of a high school teacher in a southern state for the heresy of teaching Darwin's evolution aroused him to a conviction that he ought to speak out without mincing words and declare for truth. People respect me, he said, in discussing his program. They know that I'm honest and that I haven't an axe to grind. They like me because I like plants, and they trust me because I've never misled them. I guess if they know me at all, they know I'm a fairly decent, law-abiding, ethical sort of man, and what I say would carry weight with a lot of folks who wouldn't listen to others. The time has come for honest men to denounce false teachers and attack false gods. In a memorable address in a San Francisco church, Luther Burbank declared to the world his belief in righteousness and the highest spiritual development, and his utter unbelief in the mockery of dogma. A whirlwind of hatred engulfed him within 24 hours, tempered only by fluent and admiring congratulations from thousands and thousands of the thoughtful. If he had contented himself with his message, this storm would not have affected him, for he had weathered several similar ones before and had come off unscathed. But he was misled into believing that logic, kindliness, and reason could convince and help the bigoted. I was with him during those weeks almost constantly. I saw him growing tired and harassed, not by the dispute or the vilification heaped on him by the regenerate, but the physical task entailed. He tried to reply to all the letters, using mild but fearless good sense with those who attacked him, and amplifying his original statement for those who supported him. He fell sick. The sickness was fated to be his last. What killed Luther Burbank at that time, and in just that abrupt and tragic fashion, was his baffled yearning, desperate effort to make people understand, his desire to help them, to clarify their minds, and to induce them to substitute fact for hysteria, drove him beyond his strength. He grew suddenly old, attempting to make reasonable a people which had been unreasonable through 20 stiff-necked generations. His age, his long life of exacting physical labor, and his pitiful attempt to give sight to the willfully blind brought him to his bed. He died, not a martyr to truth, but a victim, the fatuity of blasting, dogged falsehood. No sunnier man ever lived than Luther Burbank. It was one of his cherished illusions that he was an old growler. He did growl. He growled in a good-humored, whimsical, ludicrous fashion that deceived no one. He growled mostly at himself, though sometimes at people or about people who were delaying the game. Never, though, did his growling hurt or wound or really convince. It was one of his games. His laughter was ready and contagious. He could not tell a funny story, though he often tried, and would get more enjoyment out of his own inability to approach the point with the delicate abruptness of the born yarn spinner than he could have got from the best jest ever coined. What he could do was to wring the neck of a proverb until it was funny, or put a situation into a very few excruciating phrases, or twist an otherwise labored statement into a terse and pungent epigram. Perhaps the best, but certainly one of his most characteristic epigrams, was the one called forth when some well-meaning acquaintances caused him a great deal of worry through ill-advised efforts in his behalf. That is to be found in this volume. I would rather have a dozen enemies than one fool friend. He skylarked like a boy, and his wife tells of evenings when she was driven to the sanctuary of her bedroom, and by the wild and boisterous hilarity of Big Chief and Betty Jane, her niece and ward. They would romp, roar, wrestle, dance, get laughing, and roll on the floor. They were worse, Mrs. Burbank says, than a house full of growing boys. Luther Burbank liked romps and laughter and physical expressions for his exuberance of spirits. A fair joke on himself always found him a good audience, but he was sensitive about jokes made around or concerning his work. The stock jest employed in 1,000 forms that made him the creator of absurd plants through the crossing of two. Luther Burbank crossed the eggplant and the milkweed to make an omelet plant, is one of the cruder and more familiar guises of this classification, left him a little cold. The slight innuendo, probably wholly unintentional on the part of the jesters, hurt the man whose every thought and activity was motivated by a transcendent love of plant life. One of his fool friends sent him, on one occasion, a phonograph record of a monologue by a heavy-handed jokesmith on Luther Burbank and his marvelous creations in plant life. Presumably, it was funny, but Mr. Burbank winced when it was run. It was characteristic of him, though, that he would not destroy it. Perhaps the reason may be guessed by indirection from this epigrammic description he once gave of an important man who engaged in a newspaper controversy with nitwits. "Too bad," he said. "He didn't accomplish anything except to bring a lot of nobodies into the limelight by answering them." Merry, humorous, whimsical, loving life, and loving laughter, Luther Burbank radiated a personality that drew toward him every one he encountered. Strangely enough, this appeal he had for people attracted them even through correspondence or through the less immediate agency of the newspapers and magazines. Thousands who had never seen him felt affectionately towards him. After his death, messages poured in for weeks from all over the world and from all sorts of conditions of people, and almost without exception, they wrote proudly that they had always respected, honored, and loved him. What was this aura, this radiance, that communicated itself to men, women, and children everywhere? Luther Burbank wrote comparatively little for publication. His interviews in newspapers and magazines scarcely mirrored the man. True, hundreds of thousands saw pictures of him, printed or on the silver screen, but in this day, when everyone from champion sprinters to little princes in the throes of baptism is in the weak lies, it seems remarkable that he was signaled out of the ruck. The explanation that he loved and worked with the flowers that speak every language and to every age is scarcely adequate to explain the universal love called forth by this quiet little man. Perhaps his own theory of life and the future contains the soundest explanation. Luther Burbank believed neither in heaven nor in hell, in the transmigration of souls nor the translation of the body. The ultimate doctrine in his creed was an unshaken faith in the immortality of influence. For him, the life everlasting was a phrase, a figure of speech. He had as little curiosity about the unknowable as any man who ever lived, and considerably less concern with the future. For him, life overflowed with wonder, beauty, delight, and the work he found committed to his hand, and whether anything was to go on for him or not interested him not a whit. Sufficient unto the day was the heaven thereof. But he did know and confess an abiding faith in the everlasting and eternal and all-important power on the race, the world, the scheme of things, on all life of influence. To his mind, the influence shed by a bad man was that man's own reward and punishment. The influence of a good and pure and worthy life was pervasive and everlasting. And there was a touch of the mystic about Luther Burbank. He actually realized that influence, good and bad, as a tangible, concrete, observable power in the world. He could feel the effect on his own life of the Judas Iscariots of time as perceptibly of Jesus Christ, the eternal malevolence generated by tyrants, assassins, inquisitors, gunmen, and moral perverts was to him as potent for evil as the everlasting goodness and altruism of the Gautamas, the St. Johns, the Constantines, the Emersons, the Clara Bartons, and the Jacob Reeses. You could not, he said, either thwart or kill the influence of human lives. He lived in entire confidence that good work, well done, sincere motives, and loyalty to high ideals formed the whole duty of man. To these, he added, for the creation of a real heaven on earth, the single essential, love. As far as in him lay, he lived his creed. He died without in the slightest amending or altering it, and stories that, in the end, he recanted or turned to religious teachings or teachers for consolation or comfort are, at best, apocryphal, at worst, impudent falsehood. No man in death ever presented a countenance more beautiful, peaceful, or serene. He was like a child asleep. The hand falters and fails at an attempt to describe Luther Burbank clearly for those who never saw him, and for those who, having seen him for a moment or an hour, caught only a meager glimpse of him as he was. Small, lithe, slightly stooped, with knees and elbows bent a little from long years of the hardest physical labor, Luther Burbank was yet so stamped with the outward symbols of an inward grace as to stand out in any crowd as sharply as a lighthouse in a fog. Everywhere people recognized him as somebody. His personality flowed from him almost visibly. He had a peculiar indifference to the looks of his clothes, coupled with the most meticulous care as to their quality. The result was that when he looked most a tramp at a casual glance, close scrutiny identified him as well dressed. In his gardens, no matter how dirty, warm, or disheveled he became, he was always more picturesque than he was ordinary. He had a way of wearing his hat, pulling a muffler about his neck, or slipping on gloves that gave him an indubitable air of gallantry and personableness. If he had been a banker, he would have been famed as the best-dressed man in town. His energy, his enthusiasms, coupled with his high spirit, combined to give him an almost boyish appearance, despite his silvery white hair and the deep lines that experience and laughter and grief had carved in his face. Sculptors said he had a perfect head. All his pictures show beauty, in the face as well as in the set, shape, and size of his head. The growth of his mind and soul registered itself on him. If at 40 he was a good-looking man, at 70 he was strikingly and arrestingly beautiful. There is no other word. He was never handsome. His eyes were a deep and placid blue, and a little roguish.